Welcome to Dare to Soar with your host, Dr. RC. Dr. RC will empower, encourage, and strengthen you. She will help you to soar to your highest potential while instilling hope. Please welcome the host of Dare to Soar, Dr. RC.
Good Saturday morning, Eagle family. Oh, what a fantastic show that we are going to have. Now, I must share with you before we get started, this is a show of compassion, about advocacy, as well as enlightenment and knowledge that will be shared. The title of this morning's episode is Grief Beyond the Silence, the Power of Certification in Healing and Hope. I want to tell you a bit about my guest for this morning, Dr. Leticia Villarreal Sosa. What a wealth of knowledge she brings to the table. But I just want to get into the thrust of this before I start sharing all that she has done. Just want to give you a teaser, if you will. She's an associate dean for research and faculty development and professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. Her current research focuses on utilizing photo voice with Muslim, Arab, American, and Latinx communities as a tool for advocacy and a Spencer-funded immigrant study equity project. Her most recent book, Chicago Latina Trailblazers, focuses on the testimonies of Latinos in Chicago who were activists. Yes, I did say that, in the 60s and the 70s, making a significant impact in the area of health, education, policy, and social services. But Eagle family, that's not all. She was awarded a 3-year grant from New York Life Foundation to develop a culturally informed response to grief and loss certificate for school-based professionals. She has received several honors, including the Book of the Year award for her book entitled School Social Work, National Perspectives and Practices in Schools, the best conceptual article published in 2021 in the International Journal of School Social Work of Education for Decolonizing Human Rights Approach to Study Abroad, the Daveland Diversity Leadership Award in 2022, and the Gary Lee Schaefer Award in 2023 for faculty who have made significant contributions to the field of social work. Dr. Villarreal Sosa, how are you doing this morning?
I am doing very well. Thank you so much, Dr. RC. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine because I'm so excited for you to share this information, especially for a couple of reasons. The opportunities that professionals are going to have once you impart such great information, but also the compassion that you bring with this subject in itself. And then as we go into the holidays, so what a perfect time to share this knowledge as well. So with that being said, Dr. V, just share what inspired your journey into the study and certification of grief work.
Wow. Well, I think there's two things. One is just in general, as a school social worker and someone who trains school social workers, I felt like there's a real gap with both the content and professional development in two areas. And so one, the gap is in really culturally responsive approaches, because everything we learn pretty much in school social work is very race neutral. It doesn't account for diversity and lived experiences for minoritized individuals. And so I think that's a general gap. And then you add on issues of grief and loss. One, I think often as a profession, we're very uncomfortable. Most of us don't get trained in that area, or it's just the very, basics. People learn the Kubler-Ross stages of grief, and it doesn't go too much further than that, right? And so this was really an opportunity to explore more deeply, right, grief and loss, but from this culturally informed lens. And the other sort of driving force at the time was that we developed this in the midst of the pandemic, COVID-19, in the midst of all of this racial reckoning that was happening in the country. And so things that as people of color, we already knew, like that was our lived experience. It wasn't new for us, right? But all of a sudden there was a national conversation about this and it was being recognized at a larger level. And so that was an opportunity for us to really, develop this program, this certificate, this training at a time when people were really sort of demanding this, and finally, kind of there was an opening to really acknowledge the need for training in these anti-racist, culturally informed responses to grief and loss, but really in general, right? And so this was just the right timing, the right opportunity to really move this forward.
Oh, I just absolutely love that. All these great nuggets. Eagle family, I know that those notebooks should be filling up quite quickly because the information that's being shared or continue is going to continue to be shared during this hour is going to just blow your mind. Let me just say that. And simply because of, as Dr. V just shared, all that has transpired to bring her to this point and led her to this work that is so critical and pivotal as well. I want to ask this next question, but I know that a commercial break is about to come up. So I'm going to ask it, and then I'm sure it'll be time to go to a commercial break. But guys, and there it is. The question is, when we speak of grief beyond the silence, what does that phrase personally and professionally mean to you? But we're going to go to a commercial break. I promise, Eagle family, I will repeat the question when we return with Dr. V, the knowledge that she's going to be sharing. So don't go away. Go get that cup of coffee, that additional cup of coffee, that water, that tea, and we will be right back.
Dr. RC will share extraordinary resources and services that promote educational success, as well as making a difference in the lives of all social workers, as well as the lives of children, adolescents, and teens of today. She will have open discussions addressing many of the issues that we face about our youth and how being employed in the uniquely skilled profession of social work for over 18 years has taught invaluable lessons through her personal experiences. She will also provide real-life facts, examples, and personal stories that will confirm that why serving as a child advocate is extremely beneficial when addressing the needs of the whole child. Listen live to Dare to Soar, Saturdays 10 a.m. Eastern, as Dr. RC will provide thought-provoking information that will empower, encourage, and strengthen students, families, and communities across our nation. You can also visit her at soarwithkatie.com. Author, radio show host, and coach John M. Hawkins reveals strategies to help gain perspective, build confidence, find clarity, achieve goals. John M. Hawkins' new book, Coached to Greatness: Unlock Your Full Potential with Limitless Growth, published by iUniverse. Hawkins reveals strategies to help readers accomplish more. He believes the book can coach them to greatness. Hawkins says that the best athletes get to the top of their sport with the help of coaches, mentors, and others. He shares guidance that helps readers reflect on what motivates them, rediscover and assess their core values, philosophies, and competencies, find settings that allow them to be the most productive, and track their progress towards accomplishing goals.
Well, welcome back, Eagle family. Yes, it's me, Dr. RC, and of course, you're listening to Dare to Soar. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. I have with me Dr. Leticia Villarreal Sosa. What are we speaking about? I feel your energy as to what you would like to know. Grief beyond the silence, beyond the silence. Oh, take these nuggets that Dr. V is dropping this morning. The power of certification in healing and hope. I promised you that I would repeat the question that I asked right before the break. So, Dr. V, I want to repeat it for the Eagle family. When we speak of grief beyond the silence, what does that phrase personally and professionally mean to you? Please share.
Thank you. And I think that is an excellent question. It is a deep question. And I think that question really gets to the heart of the work that we're really trying to do here. And so I'll speak first on a personal level. I think there are two themes that we talk about within this certification program. And one of them is the notion of disenfranchised grief, right? And so those are types of losses in our society that are not recognized. And then there's another, and I'm going to get a little deeper into both of these, but I just want to put the words out there first. And then the other is suffocated grief, right? And that's not only is your grief not recognized, but now you're punished for your grief, right? And so when you ask about this notion of, beyond the silence, right? That's really what we're trying to highlight here is we're trying to highlight, grief and loss that has often been silenced, that is not even recognized by our society. And so I'll start with a personal example. So I am a caregiver. My husband has young onset Alzheimer's, and I would say that we're definitely in this category of disenfranchised grief, right? In the sense that it's young onset. So all the stuff out there on Alzheimer's is about older adults, right? And there's nothing that really recognizes what a middle-aged person who's just really at the peak of their life, right? At oftentimes when we're in our late 40s or 50s, right? We really are at the peak of our careers. Finally, this is when, as a woman, right, you've raised your children, maybe you have taken care of your parents, and all of a sudden it's your time, right? Your children are out of the nest, right? You've launched them, and then boom, you get hit with this illness, this disease, right? And so we're completely invisible in terms of the Alzheimer's community, right? Most people recognize and think of Alzheimer's, they think of the 80-year-old, the 70-year-old, the grandparent, the older parent. And we completely forget about this population, right? So you're going through this process where you don't really have community, and there's nothing, right, that speaks to your own lived experiences. And then on top of that, being a woman of color, being a Latina, I go to these like Alzheimer's support groups for people in my age group, for young onset, and they're predominantly white, and upper middle people with resources, right?
Mhm.
And so, and I know that, for example, in my community, young onset Alzheimer's is it disproportionately impacts my community. And I look around and I ask, well, where are they, right? Where are these folks who need these services, but they're not present here? So that really tells me that the services that are being offered are not culturally responsive, right? They're not inclusive. They're not services that really speak to their needs because they're not there. And then when you think about our work as school social workers with children, right? Think about the kids in your school, because when people have young onset Alzheimer's, they they maybe they have children. Sometimes they have kids that are even elementary age when it
Yes.
hits them. And so you have a child in a school with a parent with Alzheimer's, with young onset Alzheimer's, and they're invisible. No one may even know or have services. And a lot of times in the schools, right, when we do offer services for grief and loss, they're very typical services for bereavement, right? Not when a parent is still living and you're losing that parent. And so that in my personal life, right, that's one example, and I can give others, right, but that's one example of that notion of disenfranchised grief. And in terms of the notion of suffocated grief, and so this, delves into kind of now the professional in terms of thinking about the youth that we work with. Suffocated grief is now when a lot of times youth of color, so say that you have this child that has this parent with Alzheimer's, or maybe another type of loss, right? Any other type of loss, and they're grieving, and it's not a recognized, say that it's a child with a parent who's been incarcerated, right? So
Mhm.
that's a disenfranchised grief because that's a grief that's not recognized. Or sometimes even I work with youth when there's in a community where there's a high rate of gang violence, and say that there's a youth that dies, and because of how society often doesn't value those young people, the other kids go to school. And what I experienced in this one particular urban setting is the kids were just expected to go to school the next day. And and just take their tests and act like nothing happened when they lost a peer. And that was partly because the adults around them didn't value the life of the child that had died as a result of a shooting, right? So it's disenfranchised, but now becomes suffocated grief when these kids are grieving, right? But now they're maybe acting out in some ways, right? Like I had this one young man that I interviewed for when I was doing a research study that focused on this transition to high school, and it was in a community where they were dealing with a lot of grief because of the high rate of gang violence in that community. And he definitely had witnessed deaths, and he had been shot himself at one point, right? But had survived. And so this child had a lot of both trauma and disenfranchised grief, because that grief was never recognized. So sometimes he had a really hard time like managing his anger, or or maybe he would sort of disconnect from school, or maybe like, so he had some behaviors. He would self injure. He was also using substances, right? But all of this was coming from grief. But when you look at a young man in a low income community who's a person of color, who's Latino or Black, what are you going to see? You're just going to see, oh, that kid's a potential gang member, or that kid is, so you're going to see these behaviors, and you're not going to see these behaviors or the school system. When I say you, I mean like the school system, right? Often these children are just viewed as, oh, this is a problematic child. They just need to be expelled. They need to be punished. They need to be, right? So now children are grieving. Now we're punishing them for their grief, where what they're really asking for is they're really asking for support and connection. I found that I often was the only person or the first person that really listened to them, right? And really held space for these young people who were going through this type of grief. And so these are things that we see every day, but often we're not aware of it, right? Because again, not only is it disenfranchised, but for youth of color, they get doubly punished for it. They end up with suffocated grief because we punish them for their grief.
My. Didn't I tell you Dr. B was going to be dropping all these golden nuggets? Get those notebooks together, guys. It is time for another commercial break. Do not go away. I promise Dr. B has more to share. We'll be right back.
Did you know that your beliefs create your entire reality, but it's the subconscious beliefs that do most of the creating? Belief shifter and life coach Shiraz can help you identify those limiting beliefs and eliminate them, often in a single session.
Like it was almost instant, like I had relief right away.
Creating better health, relationships, careers, and finances. Let Shiraz help you step out of safety and into awareness.
Definitely something's happening. It's like a flow inside. It feels good.
Whether in person or online, Shiraz provides personal coaching, belief shifting. Visit Shiraz at energeticmagic.com or call 416-529-7429. Energetic Magic. Find your greater happiness. Be well. Be aware. Be magical.
Are you struggling to care for elderly parents or a spouse? Do you wonder if being a caregiver is making you sick? Are you worried about taking time off work to care for elderly parents and balance work, life, and caregiving? Has caregiving become exhausting and emotionally draining? Are you an aging adult who wants to remain independent, but you're not sure how? I'm Pamela D. Wilson. Join me for the Caring Generation radio show for caregivers and aging adults, Wednesday evenings, 6 Pacific, 7 Mountain, 8 Central, and 9 Eastern, where I answer these questions and share tips for managing stress, family relationships, health, well-being, and more. Podcasts and transcripts of The Caring Generation are on my website, PamelaDWilson.com, plus my caregiving library, online caregiver support programs, and programs for corporations interested in supporting working caregivers. Help, hope, and support for caregivers is here on The Caring Generation and PamelaDWilson.com.
Grief Beyond the Silence, the Power of Certification in Healing and Hope. That is the topic for this morning. I have Dr. Leticia Villarreal Sosa, who is my guest for this morning. Yes, this is Dare to Soar, and this is me. It's me, Dr. RC. I want to jump right back into our questions because there is so much information that I would love for her to impart. Get those notebooks, get that coffee, tea, water. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. So, Dr. V, how do you believe silence around grief has shaped the way we as professionals and communities respond to loss?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, as I was saying earlier, I think there's a lot of missed opportunities, right, to really support each other as a community and to really support youth when there's silence around grief. And I think a lot of that really comes from, again, our own personal discomfort. In this certificate program that I developed, um, one of the things that surprises a lot of people in the process is that we ask for a lot of personal reflection. So it's not just like, oh, you're learning the content and great, like I'm learning this, but we ask people to journal. We ask people to reflect. We ask people to think about their own grief and loss experiences. And so sometimes that's hard, right? Because that's a lot of work to ask us to examine things that we have not looked at before, or maybe that we were not aware of before. And so I think the first part of it is really dealing with our own stories of grief and loss and our own potential discomfort around grief and loss. That critical reflection is really important. And that's I think one part of it. And then once we've sort of done that and we've developed that awareness, then we can begin to see like the systems around us and potentially try to be mindful when we're setting up services and thinking about how we can reach some of those kids, because the example that I had given before, right? When we miss these types of loss, these disenfranchised or types of loss, we do end up inadvertently perpetuating the suffocated grief and loss, where we see kids, that whole school to prison pipeline, or we see kids expelled or suspended, or all these different things that we see happening. And so often, right, it's grief and loss is at the center of that. And so I think we're missing a lot of opportunities uh, for healing ourselves, right, and also for providing healing spaces for others.
Oh gosh. So I'm getting ready to hit you with the hot question here as we go into it. So with that being said, I feel like this is a great segue to go into this next question, which is why is formal certification and grief counseling or um, support so vital in today's helping profession? That is a loaded question because there's so much going on across the globe right now. But I'm going to dial back and give the floor to you. So give the
Yeah.
virtual floor to you.
Well, like I said, so I am trained as a school social worker. I train school social workers. I worked in schools for many years, and I currently still design curriculum, right? And in my current role here at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, I was responsible for actually completely revamping the entire curriculum that had not been revamped in like 10 years. Um, and the reason that was so important, because so many of us, but again, it goes back to like looking at yourself, right? So many, we had to we can't just change the curriculum without building capacity of the faculty and helping them to understand sort of where the field is, right? And so one reason that certification is so important is because often in our programs, this is not content that gets presented. And so, one of the responses sometimes with some folks that sign up. So we have two components to the certificate program. One is the legacy program, which is 8 modules that really delves deep into these topics from a culturally informed anti-racist perspective, right? And we talk about things like, for example, historical trauma, which is not something that's typically presented in a school social work program or social work program in general, or other mental health professions, right? And these mental health professions also often really center, again, just white centric, but also over pathologize grief and loss, right? So we want to label everything with these DSM labels. And often the responses that people have are just normal responses, right, to grief and loss. And there's this one book that is called something like It's Okay to Not Be Okay. I don't remember the title exactly, but it's basically, I found that book so refreshing because we put so much pressure on people going through grief to do it in a
Yes.
time limited way. This is what it looks like, this stage oriented process. And this woman is basically saying, especially with types of grief not um, that are not developmental, right? If you are a person who loses a young spouse, that's not normal. If you are a parent who loses a child, that's not normal. That's not like a developmental type of grief or type of loss that you might expect. And and so I think that we need to get away from some of the ways that we are trained, right, in these very stage oriented, pathologizing sort of models of looking at grief. And so what people will find in this certificate is a very different approach. So what I was going to say is some folks who want to just enter the Train the Trainer program, because we have two. So this foundation legacy program, and then we have a Train the Trainer where you can take some additional modules to then train other people in your school. And some of those folks are like, oh, I don't need the foundation program. I don't need all this. But then they go through the Train the Trainer, we let them, we make an exception, and then they're like, oh, but they really didn't have all this other content that's in the legacy program, because there's assumptions that we already know this
Mhm.
stuff when really we don't, because what we're doing is presenting it from this very unique perspective, and we're presenting things that are typically not taught in mental health programs. I would love to know from your audience, like, how many of you have heard of historical trauma and know what that is? How many of you have heard of suffocated grief and know what that is, right? Those are not typical things that are taught. But if I ask you, oh, do you know the Kubler-Ross stage-oriented model of grief? Most people would raise their hand, right? Most people know that. But we're sort of saying, let's unpack that. Let's challenge that. No, that's not what grief is like. And actually, most people don't even know that Kubler-Ross didn't even, develop that for people who are going through grief. It was like a model that was developed based on people who were dying themselves, right? But now we've applied this stage-oriented grief model to grief work in general. And so what we do is we sort of challenge a lot of traditional notions of grief and what grief should look like, and methods that really, pathologize grief.
Oh, wow. Guys, I told you the nuggets are dropping. The nuggets are dropping. It is time for another commercial break. Don't go away. I'm not letting Dr. V go just yet. We do have more time. So we will see you after this commercial break. Be right back.
Mike Zorek, a three-time California state champion in Greco-Roman wrestling at 114 pounds. Mike, blind since birth, was born in Hartford, Connecticut. He was a six-time national placer, including 2 seconds, 2/3, and 2/4. He also won the Veterans Folk-Style Wrestling twice at 152 pounds. In all these tournaments, he was the only blind competitor. Nancy Zorek, a creative spirit whose talents have taken her to the stage and into galleries and exhibitions in several states. Her father, a commercial artist who shared his instruments with his daughter and helped her fine-tune her natural abilities, influenced her decision to follow in his footsteps. Ms. Zorek has enjoyed a fruitful career doing what she loves. Listen Saturday mornings at 12 Eastern for the Nancy and Mike Show for heartwarming stories and interesting talk. What if there were a super tiny device that could diagnose the brain and is smaller than a single human hair? What if you could see inside the brain to help an epilepsy patient during surgery or to help the fight against Parkinson's disease? Dr. Patricia Broderick is proud to announce the Broderick Probe, a biomedical and electronic breakthrough. Imagine a probe to help with the understanding and potential cure of brain-related diseases. To learn more, listen live to the Easy Sense radio show with host Dr. Broderick. And to help support the Broderick Foundation, please go to easysense.com and learn how, with your help, we can fight these horrific brain disorders. That's easysense.com to learn more and help support the Broderick Foundation.
Welcome back, Eagle family. Oh my gosh, this conversation, I know that is eye-opening, enlightening, and can you feel Dr. V's compassion for this topic? I know you can. I can feel the energy, and we're just exchanging across the screen, so I know that you're feeling the very same way. This is such a critical conversation to have. Grief beyond the silence, the power of certification and healing and hope. I want to continue on because I'm trying to pull every ounce of her for this hour that I have her with me before it's time for the show to end. With that being said, Dr. V, can you please share how this certification process helps balance professional boundaries with personal empathy?
Yes, that is a very good question. And actually, we have a module in our training certificate program that exactly addresses that. So, um, but I think so one of our modules focuses on professional self care. But what we wanted to do with this module, and so you speak to boundaries, right? Balancing the empathy with the boundaries. But what we wanted to do here is not just focus on that individual system of self care, right? Because as a caregiver of somebody with dementia or Alzheimer's, I've always said, like, the worst thing that anybody could ask me is, are you taking care of yourself? When we don't have the systems in place in our society to support people in my situation, right? So obviously, we do have people think about their like this notion of their professional, like their self-care, and think about these things of balancing, right? Because we want people to have that empathy and to be able to really connect and in some ways, right, be present in ways that sometimes our clinical training doesn't doesn't permit us to be, right, because we get trained in such Western kind of notions and separation, and we sometimes lose the humanity in the work that we do, right? And so we want people to be grounded in that sense of humanity and collective humanity, right? That we really do share a lot of experiences, and that's why this program is also very self-reflective. But in this module on professional self-care, we also really challenge people, because we want also administrators, right, school leaders to take this certification, not just the people delivering the service, because they're accountable for providing school spaces that also are supportive for people, that provide opportunities for community self-care. So what we talk about here is this notion of community care, not self-care, right? Because oftentimes, right, there's a critique of this notion of self-care, that as professionals, we can just somehow keep going and keep going. And if we just take care of ourselves, we can continue to, what do they say? Like, burn at both ends or whatever, the flame
Yes.
at both ends or whatever. And just, but but that's not right. I mean, obviously, many of us are very committed and we want to work so hard and we're so passionate about the work that we do. But we also need systems of care, right? So we need, for example, schools that set up time when people can collaborate and be in community and get opportunities for, say, group supervision with each other, right, to check in, or opportunities for relationship building, or so what are some ways that the school system itself, and I'm using schools as an example because that's what we center, right? We center practice in schools, but really this applies, we say the certificate applies to anyone basically who works with youth. And so just think about your own systems, right? Your own organizations where you might work, and what are some ways that the organization itself or the leadership in the organization sets up space for you to be able to have those boundaries. And that's the tough thing, right? Because we see, like, you mentioned another part of my work, and it's with youth, immigrant youth in schools, right? And it's really tough when you have a school social worker in a school where she's the only one, and she's trying to advocate for this very vulnerable population, right? And then has to be really mindful of what are the limitations within her own context. Say that they're in the school in a context, in a Southern context, where it's a very anti-immigrant, context or community, right? And so that person has to be very mindful of their own boundaries and their own limits in terms of what they can do so that they continue to serve those communities, especially when they don't necessarily have a larger community of school social workers. But I think, so I'm putting it back on the people in positions of power who can make a difference in schools, right? And who can be really mindful about thinking about how do you support your staff? What are some things that you can do to create structures in your school to allow for community self-care? So for people to be able to take care of each other and to provide systems of care so that people can maintain these boundaries and can maintain the empathy and don't have to deal with, the high rates of burnout and the kinds of things that we often deal with in our profession.
Oh, yes, yes. And I'm so glad that you pulled that apart in that way, because oftentimes we know that there are a lot of misconceptions. So, with that being said, what are some of the most common misconceptions about grief that certification training can help address?
Mhm, mhm. Um, so the most common sort of misconceptions are, one is that grief and loss is just about bereavement, right? And so I think when you look at other resources that are out there, other types of training programs, they really center just the death of a loved one, right? And so that's the first myth that we sort of dispel, is that this is not just about the physical loss, right? Or the death of a loved one, that there are many forms of grief and loss, particularly in communities of color where you have compounded grief because you have all these different types of, I mean, think about a family like during, the COVID pandemic that we just went through, communities that experienced disproportionate loss, right? So they experienced trauma on a community level because of how much loss they experienced in their community because they were disproportionately impacted. Plus, type of it's a type of disenfranchised grief because it became so politicized that youth then didn't want to disclose that it was a COVID related death. So now they're keeping it to themselves, right? And then say that there was job loss in that family because they were essential workers and, who maybe were impact or the were worked in the service industry who were impacted. So there's all these layers to grief, right? So I think one, just a much more complex understanding of grief. The second is the notion that grief is not a stage oriented process. So again, we introduce things like, and I'm picking on the Kubler-Ross because that's the one that everyone most knows, right? But we mention those things to say, hey, let's just quickly mention these because this is where most people are coming from and how you've been trained. But now let's look at grief in a different way, and let's move away from these stage oriented type of approaches. So that's the second, and there's more. So we'll come back and share more after the commercial.
Sounds great. Guys, it's time for another commercial break. I promise Dr. V will provide more detailed information as a second response to this question once we return. We will be right back.
Author, radio show host, and coach John M. Hawkins reveals strategies to help gain perspective, build confidence, find clarity, achieve goals. John M. Hawkins' new book, Coached to Greatness: Unlock Your Full Potential with Limitless Growth, published by iUniverse. Hawkins reveals strategies to help readers accomplish more. He believes the book can coach them to greatness. Hawkins says that the best athletes get to the top of their sport with the help of coaches, mentors, and others. He shares guidance that helps readers reflect on what motivates them, rediscover and assess their core values, philosophies, and competencies, find settings that allow them to be the most productive, and track their progress towards accomplishing goals.
Are you struggling to care for elderly parents or a spouse? Do you wonder if being a caregiver is making you sick? Are you worried about taking time off work to care for elderly parents and balance work, life, and caregiving? Has caregiving become exhausting and emotionally draining? Are you an aging adult who wants to remain independent, but you're not sure how? I'm Pamela D. Wilson. Join me for the Caring Generation radio show for caregivers and aging adults, Wednesday evenings, 6 Pacific, 7 Mountain, 8 Central, and 9 Eastern, where I answer these questions and share tips for managing stress, family relationships, health, well-being, and more. Podcasts and transcripts of the Caring Generation are on my website, PamelaDWilson.com, plus my caregiving library, online caregiver support programs, and programs for corporations interested in supporting working caregivers. Help, hope, and support for caregivers is here on the Caring Generation and PamelaDWilson.com.
Good Saturday morning, Eagle family. Once again, thank you for returning for the second half of Dare to Soar with me, Dr. RC, and my guest, Dr. Leticia Villarreal Sosa. Oh, what are we speaking about? Grief beyond the silence, the power of certification and healing and hope. Right before the break, I asked Dr. V some common misconceptions, and as you can tell, she was digging deep into it and dropping those nuggets. So, Dr. V, would you continue on with your response, please?
Yes, thank you. So to summarize, the two that I mentioned were the different types of grief, right? So it's more than bereavement, and then the grief process is not stage oriented. So those are the two myths that I had mentioned. The next one is related to that, and it's that we really emphasize that grief should not be pathologized, right? So I think that we've moved to a place in our professions where we want to give a DSM diagnosis to people for so it's sadness, right? It's not depression. It's somebody's experiencing normal sadness that would come from experiencing this type of loss, right? So we want to stay away from sort of over pathologizing grief. And again, like, as I mentioned, that one book about it's okay to not be okay, right? That we want to allow space for people to be able to go through this grief process, whatever that looks like for them. The next one is that we have to do our own grief work, right? So there is this notion that somehow we can just jump into this and be the professionals that we are and separate ourselves and just kind of, and if we don't do our own grief work in our own kind of personal self-reflection, then it's going to be really difficult to offer both a culturally informed approach if we're not comfortable with our own identities, our own positionalities, and also to delve deep into the discomfort of what it's like. Grief and loss is a difficult topic for all of us. And so we have to really do our own work in that area so that we can be fully present with the people that we work with, right? And then the last one is that there are different ways to address and address grief, right? And this is one of the big ones because oftentimes we think of sort of our clinical work, our work with youth, we think of it as a one-on-one type of process. But when you're dealing with youth of color and when you're dealing with suffocated grief, so imagine that you're dealing with a young person right now in this context, right, who's dealing with these mass immigration raids. So they are dealing with trauma and they are dealing with grief. They've lost a parent because their parent's been detained, right? So a one-on-one conversation with that youth is not going to be enough. They need to feel like they're in community, right? They need to be with other youth who are going through the same thing. And they need to understand that this is not a personal psychological issue, but this is something that's being imposed on them by these larger societal narratives about who they are as immigrant youth, right? And so we need to be able to hold that and hold space for that. And that means sometimes that we acknowledge that there are different ways outside of the traditional Western mental health approach, right? So there are communities that have their own healing tools, right? Or we have found a lot of times with, Latina youth that maybe going back to some of those ancestral practices can be very healing for them, right? Rather than this sort of Western mental health approach. And what we know about historical trauma, which historical trauma, I haven't talked enough about that term. I've mentioned the term, but let me just quickly explain it. So historical trauma is trauma that's imposed at a group level, right? So indigenous people who are Palestinians who are going through this experience of genocide and apartheid, right? It was actually originally a term that was developed on research on Jewish individuals, who have this collective trauma of the Holocaust. And African Americans having this collective trauma of slavery, Mexican Americans having a collective trauma of conquest and mass deportations in the 1920s, right? So when we talk about historical trauma, we're talking about group level trauma. So it's not a trauma against me as an individual. It's against me because I'm a collective part of this community that's being attacked at a larger level, right? And so we know from wonderful work by Maria Yellerhorst Braveheart and other people who have done work on historical trauma that individual approaches are not enough, that collective healing and collective community level approaches are what is needed to heal from those types of trauma. And so that's what we really encourage as well, is moving away from thinking about just these very narrow kind of Western approaches to how we work with youth to thinking about what are these other ways that we could incorporate that really build on the cultural strengths of communities and their own maybe indigenous ways of healing or ways of healing that are already present in the community. And I'll end. I know this is so long. I have so much to share, but I'll end on note that one of the things that we acknowledge in this program is that for a lot of minoritized, marginalized, disenfranchised communities, we have been doing this healing work outside of the mental health profession because often people were excluded, right? So many communities
Yes.
have a history of doing this work themselves because they're excluded from mainstream sort of services, right? And we honor that. We honor that a lot of communities already have people who are doing this work.
Oh, yes, 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 yes. I know, I feel like we're going to have another commercial break, but this is a question because you led right into this, actually. It's all we talk about being proactive instead of reactive, but oftentimes that direct line does not occur in that manner, which is a great number of times unfortunate. But there's a saying: when we know better, we do better. So we
Mhm.
always strive to do better in each step that we take, especially in doing work when it comes to our youth, reaching out to our communities as well, and keeping them informed and letting them know the key and the key element and importance. And I say that to ask, how can grief informed practices be integrated within schools, community
Mhm.
agencies, and clinical settings, which are all key elements because they go hand in hand and connect and link with one another?
Absolutely. And I think that is a really important question for us to think about, right? Because we are very familiar with terms like trauma informed schools, right? And we know what are some things that we can do to create trauma informed schools. But what would it look like to have not just grief sensitive schools, but culturally informed grief sensitive schools, right? And what does that look like, And I think that there's a lot of little examples, right? Like even looking at attendance policies. And the same thing goes for workplaces, right? So often we forget to think about what are again, like the adults, how does the workplace? And again, just building on my own experience, I had this, this, just this notion of it. In my university, we get 4 days, 4 bereavement days. So imagine, right? If you lose a family member, you get 4 days for bereavement. What does that do? That's just the initial shock, that doesn't even give you time to plan the funeral, much less go to the funeral and do your and to have time to grieve, right? When I lost my mother, it was interesting because in my own workplace at that time I had a boss that was like, I don't understand why you Latino, why, like, I had this other friend she's a white woman, who said, I have another friend who's Latino, and he was really impacted by the loss of his mom as well. Like, you guys seem really sad about losing your mom. I was like, she couldn't understand why I was grieving my mother so much, right? And and I was expected to just come right back to work, and after, it was like, and I did, unfortunately I did, right? And I think that's kind of a big regret that I have, that I think, but so many people don't have the privilege, right, to be able to take time off to grieve. And so I think that we can do a lot in thinking about our work settings, our school settings, to think about how they can be culturally informed, both culturally informed and grief sensitive in terms of understanding. So, for example, something very little in schools is analyzing your attendance policies. What does that look like? Do you allow for, and what and how much time do you allow for excused absences, right, for grief, and what types of grief, like what is happening in your schools right now with those children that are having their parents detained by ICE, since we're in the middle of these ICE raids, here in Chicago and LA just went through that not too long ago, right, and are still in many places in the country are still dealing with this heightened, not just enforcement, but literal like immigration raids and trauma that's being imposed on communities. And so what kinds of policies do we have in our school right now that are supporting those youth who are going through those types of both losses and traumas, right? And so I think that's one very small thing that we could look at, is just what are our attendance policies, what kind of training do we do with staff, right? Do we help all the faculty, all the teachers and the staff to be able to recognize what might be suffocated grief and teach them about this, right? And so there's a lot of education that can happen too in terms of looking at that. And then again, even looking at discipline policies and what does those look like? So I would say like very similar to when we look at trauma-informed schools, like thinking about what are some of these principles of being grief informed and what do youth need and how can you be culturally informed in that process and analyze all of your systems from, policies to practices to, the way that you build capacity with your staff and your faculty.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. It is time for a commercial break. We will be right back in a moment. Oh, I just got a signal that we can continue to go on. So no, we are good. We are absolutely good because this conversation is so well needed. When we talk about this, as I said, being proactive instead of reactive, we have to really take notice of that. And you, Dr. V, you brought up some fantastic points, especially when it comes to that attendance and that discipline. It was just right on par when you shared that information as well. So I want to go into your opinion of how do cultural competence and inclusivity play into the process of grief certification and support. Oh my gosh, I feel like that's another loaded question there, but a much needed response question because this is where we are, and these are questions that we have to hone in on to bring awareness to the topics that are being brought forth. So please, Dr. B.
Yeah. And I'm going to sound like a broken record because I'm going to say again, it starts with looking at ourselves, right? And so again, when a lot of people enter the certificate program, they think, oh, this is going to be one of these nice little these cultural competency workshops, and I'm just going to learn about other people, and that's so comfortable because I can just learn all about these other people's culture, and I'm good, right? I learned about it. Check, and tick the box. And that's not what we do, right? We tell people that, you know what, we're not giving you any prescriptive, like, this is this. No, that's not what we do. We unpack everything and we give you tools to look at your own communities, and think about how can these tools apply to your context, your space, your students, right? And so we're not about offering anything sort of prescriptive to tell you what to do. But the other part that I said that I was going to be a broken record is that that's what we start with. We start with looking at yourself and your own positionality. And that's where people are not used to doing that, because a lot of times people take these workshops and they get to learn about other people, and that's very comfortable, but we don't unpack our own biases, our own positionalities, our own privilege, our own experiences. And so that's what we ask, right? And that's kind of where we start in terms of looking at ourselves and then addressing kind of issues of power imbalances and thinking about our positionalities and what that means for how we might engage with different communities. And then looking at your community, right? And what are those needs and being responsive to that rather than some prescriptive, this is what you do kind of thing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Our time is really coming to a close. So very quickly, Dr. B, if individuals who are interested in obtaining this certification, can you share that information? And then also please share how our Eagle family can make contact with you should they have any additional questions as well.
Absolutely. And so this certificate program is currently offered on the School Social Work Association of America website. You can go to their website. There's a web page specifically for the certificate program where you could click on a link to be registered in the program. And I also want to say that currently we have a lot of scholarship money. We have a very generous grant from New York Life, who, as a part of that grant, offered so if you are currently in a grief-sensitive school, you have 100% scholarship, right? So you would not have to pay anything to take this program. If you are in any schools that are either low income or in a state that doesn't support DEI types of programs, you would have scholarship. If you are a student, if you are, so different for different people who maybe where you might not have access or funds to take this type of professional development, we want to make it accessible. And so there is a lot of scholarship funds currently through the end of January. So this would be the time to sign up if you would like to access some of that scholarship money to take the certificate. So it's on the SWA website. And then if you want to get a hold of me, you can easily Google me. I'm at University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. You can find my email there. It might take me a bit to respond, because I am very busy and I get lots of emails. But you can definitely find my information and my email there on the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley website.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. V, for being my guest this morning. This conversation has been a wealth of information. Beyond. Guys, I know that the nuggets have been dropped and you had a great number of takeaways as well. That is my time for this morning. Thank you all. I am Dr. RC. And of course, this is Dare to Soar. Never be afraid to elevate to new heights as you spread your wings and dare to soar. Thank you. Take care. Have a great one.
This has been Dare to Soar with your host, Dr. RC. Come take a ride and soar to your highest level possible each week on Dr. RC's Dare to Soar.